Okay, so I'm going to take you through the language details of Anthem for Doomed Youth, which is, other than Dulce Decorum Est, Wilfred Owen's most famous poem. It's in the sonnet form, which we'll look at in great detail later. The opening line, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, uses this, first of all, this compound phrase, passing bells, which is a description of the church bells that are associated with a funeral that call mourners to the ceremony. But the word passing is ambiguous in this compound phrase, because actually the word passing also means temporary, transient. And so we've got this suggestion here that this sign of respect, these passing bells that should be being heard for these soldiers who are dying like cattle, are actually just temporary and not even existent, as the question exposes. Second to this is the simile, for these who die as cattle. And there's a number of connotations to this, as if the men themselves are dehumanized, like the cattle that would be slaughtered en masse to feed people. They're being mindlessly slaughtered as if they are animals that would be used for food. And that emphasizes that powerful sense of dehumanization that is part of the experience of the First World War, the scale of the slaughter and the mechanical, technological nature of that slaughter. That was really the first war in history on that scale, where destruction would be in days, tens of thousands of individuals dying. This opening rhetorical question also shows that the poem is trying to find a suitable tribute or music for the dead, instead of the traditional tributes that these soldiers won't receive. And this is where the poem's title, it's an anthem, it's supposed to be some sort of celebratory song that identifies a collective cause. And it's attempting to speak for those soldiers who had no tribute, who had no formal recognition of their sacrifices and their losses. And so here we have this grim reflection in this poem on the sounds of the battlefield as if they are themselves the empty tributes to these men who died without formal recognition. It's only the monstrous anger of the guns that functions as these passing bells, this tribute to the men. And so there's a connotation here of evil, horror, and the grotesque nature of the tribute of rifle fire, that it's monstrous and horrifying. And then Owen personifies the guns, as if the guns themselves are expressing the angers of the soldiers, which is deeply disturbing because it's an unfitting tribute, monstrous anger as a tribute for someone's life. That personification seems to be actually expressing the anger of the soldiers at their own injustice, which doesn't really function at all as a suitable tribute. The repetition also of only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, reveals the speaker's anger at the inadequacy of the tributes, the fact that the tributes don't meet the expectations that we would hope to have for respectful recognition of sacrifice. These tributes, these ironically described tributes, are really just the sounds of the violent battlefield, and so actually they're not tributes at all. It's only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle. He uses a range of different techniques in these final lines here. So we've got the stuttering and rattle, the T alliteration that's evident here and here, I think connects the words stuttering and rattle with a sense of the difficulty of expressing feelings, as if the guns themselves are aware of their own inadequacy. They're stuttering, a rapid rattle. And also, in addition to that, there's an onomatopoeic quality to create the sense of the sound of the gunfire, the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle, that is actually in some ways also then about the difficulty of speaking. These stuttering rifles, not being able to express themselves clearly, can't then function as a suitable tribute. The rifle's rapid rattle, our alliteration, I think, is meant to be evocative of that quick, repetitive sound of machine gun fire, which really this is the first war to use that type of weaponry en masse. And the imagery here of the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle creates a sudden shift, suggesting the movement from life in the past to death in the present. That gunfire can only patter out their hasty orisons, and patter completes this sort of triplet of T-alliterative noises. Stuttering, rattle, patter. Can patter out. Pattering also is about not being able to express yourself clearly. And orisons are a type of prayer. So the guns are rattling out hastily these prayers in tribute to the men. These hasty orisons. This diction of stuttering, patter, and hasty again emphasizes the difficulty of speaking and develops this sense of an awareness that the tribute is not suitable or adequate in the face of the sacrifices made by the soldiers. Stuttering, patter, and hasty are all about speech in some way, or rushed, inadequate, ineffective speech. In the next lines, no mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs. So here we have this word, particularly mockeries, no mockeries now for them, with a connotation of irony and humour, which underlines the bitter sense of this inadequate tribute and compares ceremonies to a mockery, as if even if we were to have a ceremony for them, it would be a mockery of their life rather than a tribute of that life. There's no prayers nor bells, which are components of traditional ceremonial rituals that are not used for these soldiers, nor any voice of mourning. In these opening two lines of this next quatrain of the sonnet, the repetition of no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs reflects this absence of a fitting tribute, that we don't have any mockeries for them, we don't have any prayers or bells, and there's no voice of mourning, there's no one expressing mourning except the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. So the metaphor here compares the sound of artillery fire, the whistling noise and explosion of powerful artillery, to a choir at a funeral ceremony, suggesting that it's the only ritual tribute that the soldiers will receive is just continued bombardment. And then this diction here, that's part of this metaphor, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, suggests the painful sounds and a sense of insanity to describe the sound of the falling shells. Again, the weaponry is personified because the shells are wailing and they seem to be demented. And then we have this final line, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. Now this is a metonym where it functions as something that it is logically connected with. So we might have something like the White House standing for the presidency. That's a metonym. Here, bugles represent the call for mourners to a funeral. The bugles are what we would hear playing the tributes of the last post. That kind of trumpet sound. But these bugles are showing the tribute that they're not receiving, and that they're calling for them from sad shires. Shires are the names of regions in Britain where people, the countryside regions where lots of these soldiers would have come from. It's like sad states. The shires in England are the counties of the country, but they're personified here, and it's a personification of the places that they've come from, which shows the sense of grief that their deaths will have caused at home, And so there is this genuine sadness that will be experienced in response to this death, but none of it is going to be expressed. There is no fitting tribute. And so this poem seems to try and function as that tribute by expressing a sense of anger and injustice about the absence of those tributes. And those sad shires will express grief, but there won't be any formal moment to carry out that expression. Now this final sextet here. What candles may be held to speed them all? Now the candles are the traditional objects held by altar boys at a funeral to symbolize the souls of the departed. As the word speed also connects to this, it's a description that means to support the departed souls with good wishes. And that second question here shifts the poem's focus onto the quiet expressions of grief that will actually take place, in spite of the horrifying noise of the battlefield. So we have the first 8 lines depicting the battlefield itself as this kind of grim, false ceremony of grief. And then the final sextet, the final 6 lines, expressing the real tributes that will take place through the authentic emotional reactions of the people with whom the soldiers are connected. So then we have not in the hands of boys. So not in the hands of boys where we would expect to find these candles in a funeral, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. So there'll be no ceremony, but their eyes will express the authentic nature of their grief. And so the literal candles here are replaced by a figurative light and a metaphorical light in the eyes as the windows into the soul, expressing the genuine emotions of those at home and those who are still alive on the front. It's in their eyes that the holy glimmers of goodbyes will shine. It's their genuine, authentic emotion that functions as a tribute to these men. Shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. I think there's a powerful sense of beauty about the sound of the music of that line. Shall shine glimmers of goodbyes, almost as if it's quietening us to notice the glimmers of goodbyes, that we've got this shh sound that seems to be quietening us to notice the delicacy of these faint expressions of tribute, the glimmers in someone's eyes. And so that alliteration emphasizes the beauty of the genuine emotions expressed in these actions that are described. Also here is a metaphorical representation of the light of the eyes as a replacement for those funeral candles, the glimmers of goodbyes in the eyes, possibly even suggesting the glimmer, the light reflecting from an eye that has tears within it, is functioning as a metaphorical replacement for these funeral candles that are not actually going to be held for them. And then the final deeply moving lines, I think, in this poem. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall. Now the pall is the fabric covering a coffin in a traditional funeral. And pallor means the paleness. So here, the metaphor that's used is that the pale nature of girls' faces, of their brows, of their heads, will function as the fabric covering the coffins and are a mark of respect. The pale nature of girls' faces, caused by authentic grief, are going to replace the traditional fabric that you would cover a coffin in a normal funeral ceremony. So it's saying the authentic emotions there are functioning as a replacement for the formal aspects of a funeral ceremony. The flowers that you would see there are instead the tenderness of patient minds, which again metaphorically compares this emotional response, the tenderness of mental patience, shows us the genuine thoughts of those grieving, functioning as a replacement for flowers used in funeral ceremonies, the patience of people in grief, and the tenderness of their psychological state, the delicacy and fragility of their psychological state become the flowers of a funeral ceremony, the authentic emotions of true feeling. And then the final image, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. This final image I find deeply moving. It's a traditional mark of respect for the dead to draw down the blinds of the houses of families where soldiers have died. But it may also figuratively represent the darkness on the battlefield where this isn't possible, where people aren't in houses and protected safely. And so the drawing down of blinds functions as that very subtle, gentle form of tribute and figuratively represents an ending. But also potentially a quite stark, disturbing image of the families themselves turning their back on the world and remaining distant from them as a result of their grief. It's quite a disturbing and moving final image, this. And the alliteration within it, dusk drawing down blinds, I think gives those lines a sense of insistent finality and dull kind of stillness, almost as if we're awestruck in grief, which suggests the loss of life being described as something forceful and repetitive, as if fate itself is in that insistent rhythm of those last 5 words, dusk drawing down of blinds. In terms of the poem's form and structure, what you'll see, as it's a sonnet, you've got the rhyming pattern, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, F, E, G, G, and it ends with this emphatic rhyming couplet. Well, what you see in this opening octet is a description of the battlefield. It's focused on the wild, chaotic noises of the battlefield as an unfitting replacement for the tributes that these soldiers should have received. And these alternating full rhymes, cattle, rattle, guns, orisons, bells, shells, choirs, and shires, I think give us that sense of the power of the noise, but also its sense of chaotic disorientation. There's a sense of trying to find structure within the madness in that use of an alternating full rhyme scheme. And that's precisely what the poem is doing. It's attempting to impose a sense of meaning and order on something wild and chaotic. The volta, which is the point in the sonnet that takes place after 8 lines, between the octet and the sestet, the 8th line and the 9th line, usually it marks a shift in focus. And it does, as we looked earlier on in this particular sonnet, there's a turn from the battlefield to the actual authentic expressions of grief that will take place, in spite of the gruesome irony in the first 8 lines of the horrifying nature of the battlefield. So the shift in focus that takes place here moves the poem from the loud, horrifying noises of war and the battlefield to the muted, quiet, but powerful, authentic expressions of grief at home. And then that final switch to the rhyming couplets in the sestet, in that final pair of lines, I think captures that decisive sense of finality that section describes. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. It's worth thinking about this just to read the poem one more time finally, to think about the sounds and how they create this effect. So just take a look through this as we read through this at the end. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.